That old woman is the maid. Don't talk to her, my daughter-in-law, Meadow, snapped at the grocery store clerk, her words slicing through me sharper than any knife. My son and grandson guffawed, their laughter echoing the cruel dismissal. They had no idea I owned Morrison's Market, the very store where I stood, humiliated and invisible. But as I walked out clutching my worn handbag, a quiet storm brewed within me, a decision solidified by their callousness. That same day I called my attorney. The inheritance and their comfortable lives were about to change forever. You here follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has. At the grocery store, my daughter-in-law turned to the cashier and said with a sharpness that sliced through the air, "That old woman is the maid. Don't talk to her." My son and my grandson burst out laughing. They had no idea I was the owner of the very store we stood in. Later that day, I made the call to cancel the inheritance, and I felt no regret. I'm glad you're here. Follow along to the end of this story, and feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're reading from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. I should have sensed something was off the moment Meadow insisted on coming grocery shopping with us. She almost never joined in unless there was something directly in it for her. But there she was, immaculate at 10 in the morning, her flawless blonde hair pulled into a sleek, elegant bun. Her perfectly manicured hands clutched a designer handbag like it was a trophy. Something about her enthusiasm that morning should have tipped me off, but I ignored it like I always did. "Come on, Grandma Bessie," my grandson Judd called from the back seat of Blaine's SUV. "We're getting ice cream after shopping." Even at 70 years old, those words warmed my heart. It was rare these days for them to include me in anything, and hearing Judd say it made me feel, just for a moment, like I still mattered. I climbed in and settled beside him, my arthritis slowing me more than I like to admit. Meadow glanced at me over her shoulder with barely concealed annoyance. "Try not to embarrass us in there," she muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough that Blaine, my own son, wouldn't catch it from the driver's seat. I stayed silent. I'd learned long ago that answering Meadow's barbs only ever made things worse. No matter what she said or did, Blaine always defended her, and I'd be the one made to feel like I was overreacting. So I swallowed the sting like I had so many times before. The grocery store was unusually busy for a Tuesday morning. Families wrangled small children, elderly couples navigated slowly through aisles, and office workers hurriedly grabbed their lunches. Morrison's Market had been my store, my haven, for over 3 decades, long before Meadow even knew my son existed. Its familiar aisles, the comforting scent of baked bread, and the nods from employees I'd known for years always made me feel grounded. We made our way through the store with Meadow at the helm, orchestrating every movement like a general on a mission. She clutched her shopping list like it was sacred scripture and snapped instructions to Blaine and Judd like they were foot soldiers. Heaven help anyone who dared to stray from her plan. Judd walked close to his mother, occasionally glancing back at me. I tried to tell myself the look was affectionate, like maybe he still saw me as something more than the background noise of his life. But deep down, I feared it was just polite acknowledgement, the kind you give to a stranger tagging along. When we finally reached the checkout, that familiar ache tightened in my chest. The cashier, a young man in his early 20s with kind eyes and an easy smile, started scanning our groceries. He looked up at me and smiled warmly. "Good morning, ma'am. How are you doing today?" Before I could answer, Meadow abruptly stepped between us. Her voice was cold and cutting. "This old woman is the maid. Don't talk to her." The words landed with the force of a slap. My breath caught, and a burning flush crept up my cheeks. The cashier's smile vanished, replaced by an uncertain, uncomfortable confusion. He glanced from Meadow to me and back again, clearly unsure how to respond. But what shattered me wasn't just what Meadow said, it was what came after. My son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love I had, the one I had given up so much for, started laughing. Not a nervous chuckle, not a surprised giggle. No, it was a full, hearty laugh, like Meadow had just delivered the punchline to the world's best joke. Then Judd joined in. "Yeah, Grandma's like our servant," he said between gasps of laughter. His 12-year-old voice echoed with mimicry, words he'd clearly heard before in the privacy of their home. I stood there, frozen. My fingers gripped the handle of my old worn purse so tightly, my knuckles turned bone white. I couldn't look at anyone. I felt like I'd shrunk to nothing right there in front of everyone, family and strangers alike. The cashier's face twisted from confusion to pity, and somehow that pity cut deeper than anything else. He didn't meet my eyes again. He turned all his attention to Meadow, as if I truly didn't exist. Paper or plastic? He asked her, his voice noticeably cooler than before. Plastic, Meadow replied, smug satisfaction dripping from every syllable. By now, people in line had started to watch. Some stared with open discomfort, while others looked vaguely entertained by the family drama unfolding in front of them. I wished the floor would open and swallow me whole. But the worst part of it all wasn't the humiliation. It was the realization, clear, cold, and devastating, that this was how my own family saw me. Not as their mother, not as their grandmother, not as someone worthy of kindness or dignity. I was the maid, a helper, a burden to tolerate, a punchline. We walked back to the car and Meadow slipped her arm through Blaine's, talking cheerfully about what to make for dinner. Judd skipped ahead, already on to the next thing, his cruel little comment forgotten as quickly as it had left his lips. I followed behind them, the way a servant might trail their employers, carrying the bags and my shame all at once. The drive home felt endless. They chatted about the weekend, Meadow's spa day, Blaine's golf outing, spouting like nothing had happened. Nobody asked if I was okay, nobody remembered the promise of ice cream, and I didn't remind them. When we got home, I carried the groceries inside. They each scattered to their own corners of the house, and I put everything away on autopilot. Each movement mechanical, my heart sore with the weight of what had just happened. This was my life now. This was what I had become in their eyes. As I stood there alone in that dim kitchen, something deep within me began to stir, a quiet, unfamiliar shift I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to truly ask myself, is this the life I'm meant to live? Do I really deserve this? The silence of my tiny bedroom felt heavier than ever, like it had grown its own weight, pressing down on my chest until even breathing felt like effort. That night, I didn't change out of the same clothes I'd worn to Morrison's market, the ones still clinging to the humiliation I'd endured. I just sat there motionless at the edge of my narrow bed, unable to summon the energy to move. The day kept replaying in my head, looping like some cruel, scratched record I couldn't silence. This old woman is the maid. Every time I heard Meadow's voice echoing those words in my mind, it cut deeper, sharper. But as much as her cruelty stung, it wasn't what haunted me the most. It was Blaine's laughter. My son, my baby boy who once clutched my finger with his tiny hand, the boy I had raised alone after his father left, the same child I had worked 3 jobs to feed, to clothe, to give a decent life. He had laughed while I stood there, mortified, laughed while Meadow stripped me of my dignity with a smile. I looked around my bedroom, really looked. It had been so long since I'd allowed myself to see it for what it was. The smallest room in the house, barely big enough for a twin bed and an old dresser. When Meadow moved in 5 years ago, she'd suggested, in that same syrupy voice with the smile that never quite touched her eyes, that I take the smaller room. It just makes more sense, she'd said. We need the space for our things. I'd agreed, of course I did. I always agreed. It was easier than arguing, easier than being called difficult or selfish or ungrateful. After all, they were letting me live in their house. That's how Meadow always framed it, like I was a guest overstaying her welcome. And yet I'd lived here for 15 years before she ever walked through the front door. I caught sight of my reflection in the small mirror mounted across the room. A stranger looked back. When had I become this version of myself? When had I started folding inward, apologizing for simply existing in my own home? My gray hair was scraped back into the same practical bun I'd worn for years. My clothes were clean but tired, chosen for their function rather than form. I looked exactly like what Meadow had accused me of being, the help. But I wasn't always like this. I shut my eyes and reached into memory, trying to retrieve the woman I used to be. Before Frank walked out, before Blaine grew up and got married, before I had learned to dim myself in order to keep peace, I used to run a small catering business from this very kitchen. It was never glamorous, but it was mine. Real home-cooked food for local families, for birthday parties and weddings, for people who knew me by name and requested my pot roast, my apple pie. I had clients who booked me months in advance. I mattered. Then Meadow decided my work was embarrassing. Inappropriate, she called it, for someone my age. She'd whispered in Blaine's ear, planting fears about strangers coming and going, about safety, about messes and noise. One excuse at a time, she chipped away at the thing I'd built. Within a year of her moving in, my business was gone, snuffed out like it was nothing but a nuisance. And with it went my sense of identity, my independence, my pride. What replaced it was what she wanted: a live-in housekeeper, a free babysitter, someone to cook their meals and wash their clothes and keep her presence serene and undisturbed. In return, I got a roof and four walls, and silence. So much silence. But that night, sitting in the dark, that old fire in me sparked again. It was faint, but it was there, buried beneath years of obedience and compromise. I stood up and went to my closet. My fingers moved automatically, parting the coats and dresses I hadn't worn in years. There, tucked in the farthest corner, was the safe I had quietly installed long ago. My hand trembled as I entered the combination, numbers tied to the date Frank left us. Most people would find it morbid to choose such a painful reminder. But for me, that day meant survival, the beginning of a life I had to rebuild from the ashes. Inside the safe were papers, documents Meadow and Blaine had no idea existed. Bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios. After Frank left, I'd been petrified of becoming financially helpless again. So every dollar I could save from catering, every modest inheritance, every cautious investment, I'd stashed and grown it in secret. And now, under the dim light of a bedside lamp, I flipped through the most recent statements. My heart pounded with something I hadn't felt in years: power, possibility. I owned 3 rental properties in the city. My investment portfolio was well-balanced and thriving. And the sweetest revelation of all, I owned 40% of Morrison's Market, the very store where I'd been humiliated today. Bill Morrison had once been one of my regular clients. When he needed funding to expand, I was the one who quietly invested. In return, I became a partner. Silent, but legally binding. It was all properly filed. But I'd never said a word to Blaine or Meadow. Why would I? They would have inserted themselves immediately, spinning ways to help manage it, to take control, to siphon off the fruits of my labor like they had everything else. I learned early on that any sign of independence made Meadow twitch. The minute I mentioned having a small nest egg, she had pounced with suggestions. Ways I could contribute, how I might use it too, and I knew then. This quiet control she maintained over me, the constant erosion of my identity, had never been about family or love or protection. It was always about power, about keeping me small. But I wasn't small, not anymore, occasionally glancing at me with that air of performative tolerance she'd perfected over the years. And Judd was already upstairs, probably gaming or scrolling through something on his tablet. The air was heavy, not with tension exactly, but with the kind of quiet neglect that becomes normal after too much time living like strangers under one roof. I served them all, just like always. Quiet, efficient, invisible. Not a word of thanks, not even eye contact. I sat at the corner of the table with my own modest plate, barely touched it. My appetite had vanished somewhere between the bottom of the staircase and the moment Meadow said I was free labor. That phrase clung to me like smoke. Free labor. That's what I was to them. An unpaid servant they were just biding time to get rid of. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and put away and the house had gone dark and silent, I sat alone in my room staring at the moonlight falling across the floor. I thought about everything I'd given up, my time, my pride, my identity, to keep this uneasy peace. I thought about how I had let myself be reduced to nothing more than a shadow in the hall, a ghost who cooked and cleaned, a woman whose life had somehow been boiled down to waiting for someone else's needs, someone else's approval, someone else's timeline. But tonight, something inside me had shifted. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was clinging to them out of desperation. They had no idea that I had investments, property, a plan, that I had once been sharp, commanding, decisive, that I had built a life for myself long before they ever needed me, and I could do it again. This time for me. The next morning I rose early, dressed neatly, and made myself a cup of tea. I didn't cook breakfast. I didn't sweep the floor. I didn't fold laundry. Instead, I sat down at the little desk in my room and pulled out a notepad. I began listing the things I needed to do. Call my lawyer, set up meetings with my accountant, look into assisted living, but not for me, for them. There were decisions to be made, steps to take, power to reclaim. They'd spent so long seeing me as a burden, they forgot I was the one holding the safety net. I was the quiet one in the background, but I was the one who could flip the script. And I would, because this performance, the quiet act of submission and gratitude and invisibility, it was over. I had played it well, long enough to see who they really were when they thought I was too broken to notice. But I wasn't broken. I was awake. And now I was ready to act. Scrolling endlessly through social media, Judd devoured his dinner like it was just another chore before vanishing upstairs to immerse himself in video games. "This chicken's a little dry," Meadow said, barely lifting her eyes to meet mine. "Maybe go easier on the seasoning next time." I simply nodded in response. There was nothing wrong with the chicken. It was moist and seasoned exactly the way I'd always made it, the same way that had earned compliments for years. But Meadow's comment wasn't about taste. It was a carefully aimed jab, a subtle but unmistakable assertion of control, a reminder that in this household I was at the bottom of the totem pole. As I gathered the plates and began to clear the table, I half listened to them chat about their weekend plans. Meadow had a wine tasting lined up with her friends. Blaine was looking forward to a fishing trip. Judd, of course, would be staying home with me. That meant I'd be the one keeping him entertained while they indulged in their carefree leisure. "Mom," Blaine said abruptly, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was the first time he'd addressed me directly all evening. "Meadow and I were talking about getting the house painted this spring. We'll need you to pack up your room so the painters can get in there." He didn't pose it as a request. It was an order, masked as an offhand comment. "Of course," I said reflexively, "whatever you need." Meadow gave a pleased little smile, clearly satisfied with my compliance. "It shouldn't take more than a day or two," she added. "You can sleep on the couch in the basement while they work." The couch in the basement was ancient and worn out, with a spring that jabbed through the cushion like a thorn. They knew this. They knew it wasn't suitable for anyone to sleep on, let alone for multiple nights. But that wasn't the point. It wasn't about practicality, it was about power. Another subtle humiliation. Another way of showing me that my comfort, my well-being, didn't matter. Later that night, after everyone had retreated to their rooms and silence had settled over the house, I sat alone in the kitchen. The dishes were clean and stacked neatly away, yet I kept staring at them like they held answers. For years, I had told myself that family meant sacrifice, that love sometimes meant enduring, even accepting, mistreatment without protest. But what I'd heard tonight wasn't love. It wasn't kindness or respect. It wasn't even common decency. My thoughts wandered. I thought about my investments, the rental properties I owned, and my silent partnership in Morrison's market, the very same market where I'd once been treated as if I were invisible. I thought about the bank accounts Blaine and Meadow had no idea existed, the financial independence I had quietly cultivated and hidden, like a secret I should be ashamed of. But why should I feel ashamed? Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time I remembered who I truly was beneath the quiet obedience in the years of being overlooked. Maybe it was time for everyone else to remember it too. The next morning, I awoke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. While Meadow and Blaine slept soundly, and Judd was still brushing his teeth for school, I slipped quietly out of the house and walked the 6 blocks into town. The air was crisp, and with each step I took, I felt a little bit lighter, a little bit stronger. My first destination was Morrison's Market. I walked through the familiar aisles, once a place of embarrassment, and suddenly I saw it differently. This wasn't just a grocery store. This was my store too. Those stocked shelves, those friendly employees, this entire bustling operation, they existed in part because of my belief in Bill Morrison's dreams so many years ago. Because of my money, because of me. I found Bill tucked away in his office behind the customer service counter, hunched over a pile of invoices. He looked every one of his 68 years, but when he glanced up and saw me, his face broke into a smile filled with warmth and familiarity. "Bessie, what brings you in so early?" he asked. I settled into the chair across from him, a strange comfort settling over me like an old sweater. "I wanted to talk about our partnership," I began. "It's been a while since we really discussed the business." Bill leaned forward, concern flickering across his face. "Everything all right? You sound different." "I've been thinking," I said carefully, measuring each word. "It might be time for me to take a more active role in operations. I've been silent for too long." Bill leaned back in his chair, studying me, the corner of his mouth twitching like he was trying not to smile. "What kind of role are we talking about?" "I want to review our staffing policies," I said, "especially customer service training, and I think it's time I had an office here, a place to work, somewhere I can be hands-on with day-to-day decisions." We spent the next hour combing through financial reports, brainstorming operational changes, and outlining my transition from passive investor to active owner. Bill didn't just approve, he welcomed it. He even admitted he'd been hoping I'd step up more as he edged closer to retirement. As the meeting drew to a close, I hesitated, then added, "There's something else. I may need to revise my will and my business succession plans. Do you know a good estate planning attorney?" Bill's eyes sharpened, his expression turning serious. He understood more than I said aloud. "Sarah Mitchell," he said. "She's handled everything for my family. Discreet, thorough, and she doesn't judge complicated family dynamics." My next stop was Sarah Mitchell's law office. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who listened intently as I laid everything out. I spoke with a calmness I hadn't felt in years, but she still paused for a long moment when I finished. "How long has your family been treating you like this?" she finally asked, her voice low and steady. "It's been gradually getting worse over the past 5—" I started to say, before trailing off because the truth was deeper than that, but I didn't need to finish the sentence. She understood. It had been years since my daughter-in-law moved in. Over time, I began to realize that I had allowed things to escalate by never asserting myself. I'd made excuses, told myself it was just temporary, that I didn't want to cause tension. But deep down, I knew I'd been enabling their behavior, avoiding confrontation because it was easier than facing the truth. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful and serious. "What you're describing," she said gently, "sounds very much like financial abuse. Even if they aren't fully aware of the extent of your assets, the fact that they're making decisions about your living situation and future care without involving you is troubling." She pulled out a yellow legal pad and began taking notes, the pen moving quickly as she spoke. "Let's begin with your current will. Who are your beneficiaries?" "Blaine, my son, is the main beneficiary," I said. "I've left a smaller amount to my grandson, Judd, and a portion to a few charities I support." "And you want to change that," she confirmed, glancing up. I paused, then nodded, breathing deeply. "Yes, I want to remove Blaine entirely. I'd like to establish a trust for Judd that he can access when he turns 25, only if he maintains a relationship with me that's based on mutual respect, not obligation. And I want to significantly increase my charitable donations." Sarah nodded again, jotting everything down with efficient precision. "Got it. And your business interests?" "I want to maintain full control during my lifetime," I said clearly. "But I've been thinking about what should happen afterward. I might consider employee ownership, or maybe selling my shares back to Bill. I haven't made a final decision yet. What I'm sure of is this: I don't want Blaine or Meadow anywhere near my business. They don't understand it, they didn't help build it, and they've shown zero respect for the work I've done." We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing my assets, outlining the possibilities for trusts, evaluating various estate structures, and mapping out what would become a complete overhaul of my estate plan. Sarah walked me through each step, carefully explaining what would take place and how long it would take to execute everything. "We're looking at a few weeks to get all this finalized," she said, "but I can begin the paperwork today." As I gathered my purse and stood to leave, I hesitated, then turned back. "There's one more thing," I said. I want everything we do to remain completely confidential. My family cannot know about any of these changes until after they're finalized. Absolutely, she assured me. Attorney-client privilege protects all our communications. Then she paused, her voice softening. But Bessie, can I give you a bit of personal advice? I nodded. Don't let fear of how they might react stop you from protecting yourself. You have every right to reconsider your legacy, especially if the people you plan to benefit are treating you poorly. This is your money, your life. You don't owe them anything. As I walked home, a strange lightness settled into my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Meadow had taken up residence in my house, I was doing something instead of just enduring. I was remembering that I had options, that I wasn't just a helpless old woman stuck with whatever came her way. I had power, and I was finally choosing to use it. When I stepped through the front door, Meadow was in the kitchen, blending a smoothie. She barely looked up, her tone clipped and annoyed. Where were you? I needed you to watch Judd this morning, and you just disappeared. I had some errands to run, I said calmly, placing my bag down. Business matters. She blinked, caught off guard. Business matters? What kind of business matters? Personal affairs, I replied, moving toward the counter to start lunch preparations. Her brow furrowed as she stared at me. What personal affairs? You don't have any business. I continued chopping vegetables without answering. Let her wonder. Her confusion didn't irritate me the way it once would have. In fact, I almost welcomed it. She thought she had me all figured out, believed I was just a fragile, irrelevant presence in her home, someone to be tolerated, managed, dismissed. But she was wrong. And watching her begin to realize that was oddly satisfying. Bessie, her voice sharpened, edged with warning. I asked you a question. I raised my head and looked her directly in the eyes, something I hadn't done in years, and answered her with quiet strength. I had personal business to attend to. Something in my tone must have startled her because she stepped back just slightly, her hand still wrapped around the forgotten smoothie cup. Well, she finally said, her voice faltering a bit. Next time, let someone know where you're going. We worry when you disappear. I nearly laughed at that. The woman who just yesterday had been discussing my death with her friends over coffee was now pretending to be concerned about my whereabouts. How touching. I'll keep that in mind, I said mildly, turning back to my vegetables. As I stirred the pot and planned the rest of lunch, my thoughts drifted to the new documents Sarah was drafting, the office space I'd soon have at Morrison's market, and all the changes that were now set in motion. Blaine and Meadow had no idea that the ground beneath them was about to shift, and shift hard. But I did, and for the first time in a long while, I was genuinely looking forward to what came next. 2 weeks passed after my visits to Bill and Sarah. The legal documents were finally complete, ready to sign. During those days, I watched my family with a new perspective. It was like putting on glasses after years of blurry vision. Their cruelty was so casual, so woven into the fabric of daily life, it had become almost invisible to me. But now I saw it. Every dismissive comment, every patronizing tone, every time I was treated like I was nothing more than free help under their roof. And with each moment, my resolve only deepened. That morning, the air felt charged, heavy like the sky before a storm. I went through the usual motions, made breakfast, served it quietly. No one acknowledged the meal. Blaine stared at his phone, as always. Meadow chattered about her errands for the day. Judd wolfed down his food and raced to catch his bus. Business as usual, for them. At exactly 10 o'clock there was a knock at the front door. Meadow glanced up from her magazine, frowning slightly. I'll get it, I said evenly, smoothing down the front of my apron as I walked to the door, ignoring the irritation in Meadow's voice when she snapped, Are you expecting someone? As though any visitor to the house had to be my doing and my burden to explain. Standing on the porch was Sarah Mitchell, poised, professional, dressed in a crisp navy suit and holding a leather briefcase. Behind her stood a young man I didn't recognize. Good morning, Mrs. Harrison, Sarah greeted me with a polite nod. I'm here to deliver the documents we discussed. Before I could say anything else, Meadow appeared right behind me, drawn in by curiosity despite her usual indifference to anything I did. Her voice was sharp and demanding. Who is this? This is my attorney, Sarah Mitchell, I said, stepping aside so they could enter. And I believe you have something for me? Sarah gave a slight nod and opened her briefcase, pulling out a thick, heavy envelope. The documents you requested. Everything has been properly executed and filed. Then she gestured to the young man. And this is James Morrison, son of Bill Morrison. He's the attorney handling the business transfer paperwork. Meadow's eyes widened and her tone sharpened even more. Business transfer? What business transfer? I took the envelope from Sarah and felt the weight of it in my hands. That weight carried decades of quiet, steady work, years of saving, investing, and being underestimated. I had been building toward this moment for so long, even if no one around me ever noticed. Perhaps we should all sit down, I said, leading them into the living room. As we entered, Blaine came out of the kitchen, drawn by the unusual presence of strangers in suits and the formal tone that now filled the house. His brow furrowed as he took in the sight. 2 attorneys, official-looking paperwork, and his mother standing at the center of it all, holding an envelope like it contained a secret. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked as he sat beside Meadow on the couch. I remained standing, the envelope unopened in my hands. My voice was calm but resolute. "I think it's time you both learned the truth about our family's financial situation." Meadow narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about?" 3 weeks ago, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you called me the maid, in front of strangers." Meadow shifted uncomfortably, but I didn't give her room to interrupt. "You laughed when a cashier treated me like I was less than human. You've both spent years making me feel like a burden, like I had no worth beyond the meals I cooked and the laundry I did, like I existed only to serve." "Mom," Blaine started, but I raised my hand to stop him. "Let me finish." I took a breath, steadying myself. "Last week I overheard you talking with your friends, Meadow, joking about how much longer you'd have to deal with me, wondering out loud what little inheritance I'd leave behind." Her cheeks turned crimson. "You were eavesdropping?" she accused. "In my own house," I replied evenly. "Yes, I was, and what I heard made it painfully clear that you have absolutely no idea who I am." With that, I opened the envelope and withdrew the first document. I held it up. "This is official notice that I've removed both of you from my will. Judd will receive a trust fund when he turns 25, assuming he learns how to treat me with basic human decency. Everything else, every penny, will go to charity." Blaine's face went pale, the blood draining from it as if he'd just received a blow. "Mom, you can't be serious. We're family." I met his gaze firmly. "Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me." I paused. "But that's not even the most important thing you need to know." James Morrison stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the coffee table and opening it. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, looking to me for confirmation, "should I proceed with the disclosure?" I nodded once. A strange calm settled over me, deeper than anything I'd felt in years. "Start with Morrison's Market," I said. James straightened. "Mrs. Harrison owns 40% of Morrison's Market," he announced. "She's been a silent partner for the past 15 years. As of yesterday, she has assumed an active management role." Meadow's jaw dropped. "That's impossible. She doesn't have any money." James didn't blink. "She also holds controlling interests in 3 other grocery stores across the county. In addition, she owns 4 rental properties in town and a successful property management firm overseeing 12 commercial buildings." The silence that followed was absolute. I stood quietly, watching the pieces fall into place, watching the assumptions they'd lived with 4 years crack and crumble right before their eyes. Blaine's voice came out as a whisper. "How much?" Sarah consulted her notes. "Including liquid assets, business holdings, and real estate, the conservative estimate is $47 million. Meadow made a strangled noise, as if she'd been punched. Her hand gripped the arm of the couch, her nails digging into the fabric. "47 million?" she echoed, stunned. "You've had 47 million this whole time?" "I had the foundation for it," I corrected gently. "I built it from the ground up, investment by investment, while you treated me like a servant. While you talked about putting me in the cheapest nursing home you could find, while you waited for me to die so you could scavenge what you thought would be left. Blaine shot up from the couch and began pacing toward the window, his steps tight and quick. Why didn't you tell us? He asked, frustration bleeding through his voice. Why did you let us think? Think what? I cut in sharply. That you were doing me a favor by letting me live here? That I should be grateful for your crumbs of affection? For the occasional moment of decency? We would have treated you differently if we'd known, Meadow said, her voice cracking with panic. Exactly, I said. You would have treated me differently because of the money. Not because I'm a person, not because I deserve kindness or respect, just for the money. Sarah's voice was steady and composed as she delivered the final blow, clearing her throat with a practiced professionalism. And one more thing, she said calmly, is Harrison has officially purchased this property from you, Mr. Harrison. The mortgage was transferred to her company just yesterday. You now have 30 days to find a new place to live. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Their faces, once filled with disbelief, were now stripped bare with shock and devastation. Blaine sank into the couch as if his body could no longer bear the weight of his own mistakes. He buried his face in his hands. Meadow looked at me, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open in something that hovered between disbelief and fear, like she was staring at someone she thought she knew but now suddenly didn't recognize at all. You can't do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. This is our home. This is Judd's home. I kept my tone even, calm, colder than they were used to hearing. This was my home first. I've lived here for 22 years. You've been here for 5. And in that time, you've made it perfectly clear that I wasn't welcome. I picked up the documents, sliding them neatly back into their envelope, each movement making me feel a little freer, a little stronger. The attorneys will handle everything from this point forward. I'll be staying at a hotel downtown while I sort out the rest of my arrangements. I turned and walked toward the stairs, the sound of my own footsteps quiet but decisive. Behind me, Blaine's voice cracked, the desperation finally catching up to him. Mom, please, he called out, broken. We can fix this. We can change. Just give us a chance. I paused at the foot of the staircase but didn't turn around. My voice was low but steady. I'm 70 years old, Blaine. I don't have time to wait for you to figure out how to love me the way I deserve. 6 months later, I found myself sitting on the sun-warmed terrace of a villa perched above Lake Como, a soft breeze rustling the olive trees. The morning light spilled over the Italian Alps, turning the peaks into molten gold and soft rose. I wrapped my fingers around the delicate handle of a porcelain espresso cup. The coffee, as always, was perfect. Just the right bitterness and warmth, prepared every morning by Elena, my housekeeper. She treated me with an ease and kindness that reminded me what true respect felt like, something I hadn't experienced in years. It hadn't all happened overnight. After walking out of Blaine and Meadow's house that day, I spent 3 weeks in a downtown hotel while Sarah and her team conducted a full audit of my finances. What they uncovered astonished even me, a net worth of $50 million. Decades of quiet diligence, strategic investing, patient savings, modest business moves, all of it had compounded into a fortune I'd never taken the time to fully count. With Sarah's guidance, I made the changes I should have made years ago. I sold off properties, streamlined my investments, and designed a portfolio that would support a quiet, independent life abroad. I sold my grocery stores to my employees, offering them a generous buyout program that ensured continuity and fairness. The rental units I once managed were transferred to a company that would keep the rent affordable for working families. I held on to only what I needed, enough to live well, to live peacefully, and to live far away from the people who had spent years diminishing me. Choosing Italy hadn't been a difficult decision. I'd always dreamed of seeing the world, but practical concerns had always taken priority. Family, work, duty. But now, with nothing to hold me back and all the time in the world, I could finally choose me. The villa wasn't extravagant. It was elegant, refined, not showy. 3 sunlit bedrooms, each with French doors that opened onto gardens cascading toward the lake. A library filled with books I could finally read without interruption. A kitchen where I cooked when I felt like it, for no one's expectations but my own. Elena appeared quietly at the terrace door, carrying the cordless phone in her hand. "Signora Bessie," she said gently, "there's a call from America. A young man named Judd." My heart lifted. Since I left, Judd had called every single week. In the beginning, he'd been upset, confused. But as the weeks passed, his tone softened, the sharp edges of his teenage confusion giving way to a kind of introspection I never expected. Our conversations had shifted from accusations to questions to something that felt like mutual understanding. "Grandma?" His voice came through the line deeper than I remembered, touched by the changes of adolescence. "How are you?" "I'm wonderful, sweetheart," I said warmly. "How are things back home?" There was a pause on the other end. "Different," he said. "Mom and Dad are getting divorced. Mom moved out last month." I didn't react aloud. I had expected this. Without the illusion of a large inheritance to keep them bound together, there was little left holding their marriage up. Meadow, ever calculating, had likely moved on in search of her next target. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice soft. "Yeah, I think so. Dad's been asking about you a lot. He wants to call you." I let that hang for a moment before gently asking, "And what do you think about that?" There was another pause. Longer. "I think he knows he really screwed up. But I also think he's only sorry now because he found out how much money you actually had." His honesty hit me hard. There was a clarity in his voice, a maturity that neither of his parents had ever managed to grasp. "And you?" I asked quietly. "Are you sorry about the money or about how we treated each other?" "I'm sorry I laughed at you that day in the store," he said, voice low. "I knew it was wrong even then, but I did it anyway because I wanted Mom and Dad to think I was funny. I wanted to fit in. That it was stupid." My throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you for telling me that," I said, my voice catching. "It means more than you can imagine." There was a pause. Then his voice came back, sheen but hopeful. "Grandma, do you think I could come visit you sometime? Not because of the money, just because I miss you." A breeze lifted across the terrace as I looked out over the shimmering lake, where a small boat was slicing gracefully through the water. I smiled. "I'd love that, sweetheart. But only when you're old enough to travel on your own, and only if you are coming for the right reasons." "I am. I want to see where you live now. Dad showed me." After our call ended, I remained seated, letting the silence settle around me as I drifted into thought. Judd. He was the only good thing that had ever emerged from the wreckage of my years with Blaine and Meadow. Unlike them, he was still young enough to change, to grow, to become something better than the people who raised him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still one bond that could be salvaged from everything I had lost. Blaine had been calling nonstop. I refused to answer. His apologies, always channeled through Judd, were predictable and repetitive. He claimed he'd changed, that he wanted to fix things, that he was sorry. But I'd heard it all before, too many times in fact, especially when he needed something from me. And this time, I could feel that his need was simply greater, not his sincerity. Elena appeared in the doorway again, this time with a polished silver tray balanced gracefully in her hands. She placed it on the table beside me, fresh fruit gleaming under the morning light, along with a neat stack of mail. One envelope stood out immediately. The handwriting was impossible to mistake, elegant and dramatic, a swirling script I knew too well. Meadow. For a moment, I nearly tossed it, unopened, straight into the trash. But curiosity, that stubborn little voice inside, pulled at me. I tore it open. 3 pages fell into my lap, an emotional roller coaster of alternating threats and desperate pleas. She demanded I cover her legal fees for the divorce. She threatened to cut off my access to Judd if I refused. Then came the promises. She would change. She'd turn her life around, if only I would revise my will. And finally the accusations, that I had destroyed their family out of nothing but bitterness and spite. I read every word slowly, my face unmoved. When I finished, I folded the letter with care, stood up, and walked to the stone fireplace in my sitting room. I lit a match and dropped the paper in. The flames devoured it almost instantly, curling the edges and swallowing her words in a soft crackle. All that was left was ash and the faint fading smell of smoke. Not every bridge is meant to be rebuilt. Later that afternoon, I wandered through the local market in the village. practicing my slowly improving Italian with the vendors who'd become small lights in my new life. Senora Martinez, whose flowers looked like they'd been plucked from a painting, insisted on giving me extra roses. "For your dining table, Bella," she said with a smile. Yeppe the baker, with hands like oak and a heart just as solid, always saved the best loaves of crusty bread for me. These people didn't know my past. They didn't care about my bank account. They simply enjoyed my company, and I cherished theirs. This was what family was supposed to feel like. No manipulation, no judgment, no whispered expectations. Just warmth, just presence, just kindness. That evening, I picked up the phone and called my financial advisor back in New York. We talked through my latest philanthropic projects, a foundation for elderly people who were suffering from neglect by their families, scholarships for single mothers forging their own paths, and a fund to help those trapped in toxic family dynamics find a way out. Finally, my wealth was being used to nurture something meaningful, something that echoed my true values. No longer a lifeline for people who had spent years draining me dry. Now it was a light for others trying to reclaim themselves. As the sun dipped below the edge of Lake Como, spilling oranges and purples across the sky like a final blessing, I raised my glass of deep red wine in a quiet, resolute toast. To second chance, to late blooming freedom, to the audacious beauty of choosing yourself, especially when no one else ever has. I was 70 years old, and somehow it felt like my real life was only just beginning. Not long ago, someone called me a maid in a grocery store, 6 months ago to be exact. And now I was living like the queen I had always been in my heart. The most extraordinary thing, this wasn't the end of my story, it was only the beginning.